Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast, where I have someone I've been looking forward to having as a guest on this podcast for some time, Admiral Bill McRaven. I'm not going to give a story about him other than saying he's had a fascinating career, both in the Navy as a Navy SEAL and doing some amazing jobs, which we're going to talk about later. Just read his bio. Without further ado, Bill, welcome to the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. Great to be with you.
Yeah, and I've read all your books. I listen to them as audiobooks because I'm dyslexic. But The Wisdom of the Bullfrog is the one that I'm really going to talk about now. And what I loved about it is leadership made simple, but it's not easy. And that's a lovely caption of it. And I think particularly what I recommend to everybody, the bit about it, it's brilliant, timeless sayings and aphorisms. And I really love them. I'm going to sort of read them out in a minute, Bill. But why did you choose? I think you've got, there's 18 chapters and 18 aphorisms. Why did you sort of narrow it down? Because it's a nice, slim book. It's not too much. It's something that people can absorb. Why did you choose those particular 18?
You know, it's interesting. When my publisher came to me after the Hero Code, said, "Hey, we'd like you to write another book. Would you be interested in writing a book on leadership?" I said, "Absolutely. Got a lot I want to say about leadership." The problem was I had so much to say, I couldn't think about how to frame it. And as an author, once I frame the book, once I understand kind of where I want to go, it doesn't take me long to write it because I'm just a storyteller. I'm not a writer. I don't have to create, a plot. I don't have to create characters. I just have to remember the stories and put them in context vis-a-vis whatever lesson I'm trying to portray. But the more I thought about it, I couldn't frame it. And then it occurred to me, well, how did I learn leadership? And I remembered it really was from obviously observing people and watching great leaders, but it was also these sayings, these creeds, these mottos that the military has used for thousands of years to help leaders when they are in difficult situations. And I remember the first one that came to me was when I was a young ensign and I was briefing my commanding officer, who was this kind of grizzled old Vietnam vet SEAL. And I'm briefing him on a training mission. And as I get through briefing him, he says, "Well, okay, Mr. McRaven, but if you make these decisions and you take these actions, will you be able to stand before the long green table?" And I'd never heard that expression before. And of course, back in 1978, we didn't have Google. So I had to do a little research. And I found out that, since World War II times in the Navy, when you had an official proceeding, the senior officers would sit at a boardroom table that was covered in a thin film of green felt. And so when there was some sort of proceeding, the young officer had to come in, stand before the men, predominantly men back then, sitting before the long green table. And the point of his saying was, look, if you can't make your case to reasonable men and women sitting around the table, then maybe you should rethink your decisions and your actions. But then he followed that up with, look, there's only 3 litmus tests you have to take. Make sure your decisions and your actions are moral, legal, and ethical. And so that was my first bit of leadership. When I thought about the long green table, I thought, well, what other sayings kind of helped me in difficult times? And that's how I began to pull the book together.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely so clear and it's great. So death before dishonor. You can't surge trust when in command, command. We all have our frog floats. I'll talk about that one later. The only easy day was yesterday. Definitely Hell Week. That was the one. Run to the sound of the guns. Sua sponte. Who dares wins, my SAS famous motto. Hope is not a strategy. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. General Molk, I think. It plays to be a winner. A shepherd should smell like his sheep. I love that one. Troop the line, very much from my Scots Guards days. Expect what you inspect, very true. And what you walk past, you accept. Communicate, communicate, communicate. You've got some great stories on that. When in doubt, overload. And the final 2, can you stand before the long green table and always have a swim buddy? Hey, great. And I think the thing about the drills or the sayings is I found it is because when under intense pressure or when I was really scared or in the turret of my warrior wearing a gas mask and trying to encode something and there's a live enemy of 12 other tanks moving towards my 14 warriors and I was trying to think little drills and codes allow you to overcome the freeze flight fight. Is that really what you found in SEAL training things?
Well, you think about for the U.S. Army Rangers, of course, it's Rangers lead the way. And the story goes back to Pointe du Hoc during the landing at Normandy. But I think what I've seen with the Army Rangers is from the time they are young privates, every time a young Army enlisted or officer gets up, the first thing they say is, "Sir, Rangers lead the way." And it is inculcated into their Ranger DNA, and therefore they know when the stuff hits the fan, they have an obligation to lead the way.
Yeah.
So to your point, Jonathan, it's, oh my gosh, I got tanks coming at me. What am I going to do? Look, I'm in charge. I've got to lead the way. I've got to run to the sound of guns. Sua sponte is another one, which means of your own accord.
Yeah.
So once again, you see something that needs to be done, you need to go do it. Yeah. And so I think all of these help motivate, us as leaders and to some degree as followers to know the right thing to do, because all these mottos are written in blood at some point in time in the history of warfare.
Yeah. And there's no doubt about it that it's really helped people so often, certainly helped me. But I think what I'm always fascinated with leaders that I have on the guests, and you're my guest number 344. And it's a real honor, as I say, to have you on here. But one of the things in reading your stories was the moment when you wanted to break the mile record. You were an athlete at school and you hadn't quite done it, and you were just almost like your last attempt. And then your coach, he rings, your football coach, not your athletic coach. He rings you up and he really encourages you and he believes in you that you do it. And then you break the school record. And what's great with your stories is while you've lived this, what appears to people, I can't relate because he's living this kind of life up there, but actually it's so believable, your stories, and relatable. That's why 10 million people downloaded First Make Your Bed. I keep meeting people who go, yeah, I read that story or I show that video to my daughter to make her bed or to my son. So it's a bit like my motto, which the purpose of having you on this podcast, Bill, is to cascade inspiring leadership to inspiring leaders that you and I may never meet.
Right.
But we haven't got enough years left to train everybody. But if you can touch a few people and it cascades, you've made a huge difference. And your story there about how breaking that mile gave you that belief that you could then go and do SEAL training. In my case, I did the Cyprus Double Mountain Marathon. I mean, clearly my career is nothing like yours, but I set the world record for that with the two other Scots Guards troopers. And then I believed I could go and do anything. So I then went and did the airborne training with the parachute forces. And because I believed I could do these things. And any thoughts yourself about doing something early in your career, which then sets you up for success?
Yeah, and I have told this story about my coach named Jerry Turnbow, when I was in high school, to your point, Jonathan. And the reason I relate that story is to encourage other people to kind of follow in Coach Turnbow's footsteps. And so the call that he made to me, and as you point out, he was not my track coach at the time. I didn't even think he really knew who I was, because in the state of Texas, football is king, then basketball, then baseball, and then swimming. And, and you get down here when you get to track, and I was a miler. Did anybody really care about our small track team? So when the coach called me that night, he knew I was trying to break the school record. It was my last attempt. I was a senior in high school. This was going to be my last mile attempt, and I had failed miserably the week before. And he really just inspired me, and the next day I went out and broke the mile record. But of course, I never heard from or talked to Jerry Turnbow again for another 45 years.
Wow.
But what Coach Turnbow didn't realize was he inspired me. And to your point, if I realized I could set a goal and achieve it, then I realized I could go to SEAL training and make it through. And then, of course, every challenge that came up in my life, I can, make it all the way back to that phone call.
Yeah.
So I tell audiences when I'm talking to them, look, take the time to pat somebody on the back, to write them a note, to make a phone call. You have no idea the cascading, to your point, the cascading effect of a little hope, a little goodwill, a little thank you. You have no idea how that could affect somebody's life. Never pass up an opportunity to do that.
No, and the fact that you then went into the Navy SEALs, and you didn't know how long you were going to be in, but you ended up being in 37 years, and the SEALs have been around for about 60 years. and you had 37 years, hence you being called the Bullfrog, which is the oldest serving Navy SEAL. And I love that in the Navy SEAL training, in stories you told and different books that I've read, this idea of never ring the bell, never quit. And I, again, relating to your stories and mine, and I think back to doing airborne training and when the instructor was just sending me back to get the soldier who was right at the back and then take his pack on top of my pack. So I had the pack at the front and I could hardly walk. And he goes, just give up. Just ring the bell. Just get on the jack wagon. You're not
Right.
good enough. Thank you, Corporal. I'm going to keep going. And they just were testing you. And that kind of never quit. Not only that, but that your wife particularly reminded you of that when you hit a bad time. She reminded of your own motto. So it's lovely having that connection where you've got a whole family unit that
Right.
that use with each other those sayings to help each other at the lowest times. I mean, do you want to just say a bit about how important your wife has been, because she's been with you throughout the thick and thin?
Yeah, so I've been married 46 years, and to your point, Jonathan, I've got I think my story at the very end is, we all need swim buddies. So when you go through SEAL training, you never do anything alone. And when you're diving under ships, you are literally tied by a line to another diver, and they are your swim buddies. And throughout my SEAL training, I went through training with one of my fellow students named Mark Thomas, and Mark was my swim buddy. But the term has a much grander appeal because it is about, look, none of us can make it through life alone. You need a spouse, you need a colleague, you need a friend, you need somebody that's going to help you. I think in my story there, I do talk about my command sergeant major, Chris Ferris, who helped me through my difficult times, in combat. But make no mistake about it, my wife was there every step of the way. And I've been pretty open. I got fired in 1983 when I was a young Navy SEAL. And I didn't think I had a career left. And I went home and I sat down and talked to her and I said, look, I've been relieved of my command, so to speak, and don't know what to do. And, she looked me in the eye and she said, look, you've never quit at anything in your life. Don't start now. And so I made it through that difficult time because she kind of picked me up, dusted me off, said everything was going to be okay. And, at 37 years, she had to do that a couple more times when you
Mm-hmm.
get gut punched and you wonder whether or not it's all worth it. And she always told me, hey, keep moving until you make the decision that it's time to move on. But had I not had her by my side as my swim buddy, I wouldn't have made it past lieutenant junior grade. So you need somebody in your life. I don't care if you're the biggest, toughest, strongest Navy SEAL out there, or the SAS trooper, or the paratrooper, or the Scots Guards. You need somebody that can kind of help you through those difficult times. And that's
Yes.
the concept of never ring the bell. In SEAL training, we actually have a brass bell, and if you ring it, you quit.
Yeah.
But you take that mentality with you for the rest of your career. And I tell folks, look, you absolutely want to quit on bad relationships. You want to quit on drugs and alcohol and things that are ruining your life. But don't quit on your family. Don't quit on your friends. Don't quit on the mission. Don't quit on your dreams.
Yeah.
That's the part about don't ring the bell. Don't quit on things that are really, truly important and honorable and noble. Quit
Yeah.
on all bad things.
And it's so true. And again, the value of your stories in your different books are that they are so highly relatable. So when you talked about the clash with your boss and on the East Coast and the fact that it didn't work out on that assignment, I thought at the time, I thought I was God's gift, going to be an instructor at the military academy, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. I've been chosen and I'd got outstanding reports. And I got there and I was rated as average. And I went, what do you mean I'm average? I've always been outstanding. And they went, compared to the others, you're average. And I had a complete, it was my crisis, a bit like yours, really. And I thought, do I stay in? What happens? And then I reached out I brought my father's Navy cap. I thought you'd appreciate this. And he met my mother in San Antonio. And they trained and they met on and they had dated on Padre Island. I don't know if you've been to Padre
Oh my
Island.
goodness.
Yeah, and Corpus Christi, he flew from
Yeah.
there. So it's
Oh,
a
well,
real connection with what you had. But I brought and if the cap fits, wear it. And my father's cap
that's
actually
good.
fits his son. So I just thought you'd be interested in that. But the reason I told the story was not doing very well. I thought I need to be a better leader. So I reached out to people who'd served with my father in the Navy as pilots. And they all came. We had a lunch together. And one of the guys said, Jonathan, your father bought my ticket. I said, what do you mean? He said, your dad was test flying as commanding officer. My plane, which had the fault, the turbine blade broke off, cut into his side of his aircraft, caused the fire. And then Bill, his observer, said, and Jonathan, your dad saved my life too, because he ejected me. I lived. But a bit like Top Gun, Goose, your dad died when his ejector seat fired him into the tailpiece and he was killed. So he died saving our lives. And so Bill goes, you got a choice. You can be a victim, poor me, I've got no dad since the age of 2, or you can make your dad and your mum your inspiration and find other inspiring leaders, learn from them and pay it forward. So here I am with you because of those guys. And so they were my swim buddies at that time. I don't know if that sort of relates to your own experiences.
Well, it does, but of course, I have a UK connection, and that my father was a fighter pilot during World War II. He was part of the first American contingent over to the UK, part of the 309th Fighter Pursuit Group, helping the bombers cross the Channel. And he flew Spitfires.
Wow.
So, because the Americans didn't have anything that could take on the Messerschmitt at the time. So he loved, everything the United Kingdom had to offer.
Yeah, well, the fact that he flew Spitfire is very special to us because, I've got most of my relations were pilots, and unfortunately, 3 of my family were all killed flying, but that's a whole story in itself. But I love the fact that you talked about your mother and father being the greatest generation, that generation that made America, came back from the war and really turned things around, that he was a professional footballer as well as a Spitfire pilot, but the Army Air Corps into the Air Force. The the idea of Billy Mitchell that he talked about standing against corruption, and the lovely story about the Roy Rogers. People are going to have to read this. The Roy Rogers pearl-handled pistol that he found when you'd broken into the ammo dump as young boys doing things. And he asked you, and that was the one only time you lied to your dad. You said, no, no, I don't know anything about that. And then you found the pistol, which you dropped lying beside the bed, and you went, oh, all right, okay. And you didn't need to say anything. And I just thought that kind of example by father, you learned so much from that, didn't you?
And he, for the next, 60 years of his life, he never brought it up again, or next 40 years of his life, never brought, and it hung over me forever. I knew my dad knew that I had lied to him. But, one of those things that once I knew he knew, I thought he was, omnipotent and omnipresence, and he would always know every bad thing I did. So you tried to not do bad things.
That was so great. He'll be with you forever. Oh,
That's
come,
right.
my dad can see me. I thought the other thing that you touched, many things that you touched, but one I liked so much when I'm working with different CEOs, a lot of the time they try to garner popularity by going, the last CEO, he was really useless. He did this and he did this and he did this, but I'm doing all this. And you said, never be critical of your predecessor. Have some humility. Do you want to say a bit more on that topic?
Yeah. Well, after taking command numerous times over the course of my career, and you're right, Johnny, the first time I came in, you got a little swagger. You should have a little swagger. Every leader needs to have a little bit of swagger. But you come in thinking that, well, the reason I'm here is because maybe the guy before me wasn't as good. And I used to tell young officers, I said, look, the person before you was not an idiot.
Yeah.
So you do need to go into command position, whether you're in charge of a Starbucks or in charge of the SEAL teams, and realize that the person before you was doing the best job they could as well. And if you go into it with a little humility, maybe you'll find that they were trying to solve problems, and the reason they didn't get them solved was because they were difficult, challenging, hard problems. Probably not because they weren't smart and they weren't hardworking. So if you come into a new job with a little humility, with your eyes open, prepared to learn, you're going to do a lot better than coming in as the guy that thinks he can miraculously solve all the problems because his predecessor wasn't smart enough.
Yeah, yeah. It's like trying to be the smartest man in the room is a really bad mistake. Either you're in the wrong room or you need to make the room smarter, but don't try and be the smug, smartest, cleverest man. And everybody then elevates and defers upwards to you, and you end up doing everything. Well, why hire anybody else if you're so wonderful? But I thought you covered a lot of things which are very relevant for the business leaders who are listening around the world. One of the things is, challenging the decisions and the plan early. And then when you're doing the after action review, look at it again. I think that whole concept is really powerful and not done well at all in business. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, the military, and certainly, Jonathan, you can appreciate within the special operations community, but I think certainly as I have watched the military and frankly, our NATO colleagues as well, most militaries understand that, before a mission, certainly as I think about it from the special operations community, there's always an opportunity for the young officers and maybe the senior enlisted to kind of critique the plan that the commander's coming up with. Once the commander makes a decision, everybody kind of salutes smartly, moves out, does the best they can. But then after the mission, and certainly in combat, as I watched it in Iraq and Afghanistan, when the company or the platoon would come back from a mission or the troop, then they would kind of all get into a room and metaphorically take off their collar devices. So everybody was equal. And this was an incredibly important time because, again, the young corporals and the captains could go after the lieutenant colonel or the major to tell them how poorly this was and why this didn't work and why so-and-so was screwed up. And you get an opportunity to, again, you got to have thick skin. But in combat, you realize if you don't do this, if you don't critique the mission, if you're not hard on yourself and you're not hard on your team, then you're going to miss this next time you go out and somebody else is going to die or get hurt. So there's really an obligation that once a mission is over, you come back and you really do a thorough after-action review. And again, I always watched the Army Rangers, who I thought, and the SEALs, who I thought did it very, very well. I said they'd kind of take off the collar devices, but once it was over, collar devices go come back on. Everybody gets into the yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, and you go on to the next mission. But if you don't have that opportunity to provide the unvarnished truth, then you're going to make the same mistakes again, and that's not healthy for anybody.
And indeed, I sort of take what you said into the CEO and the executive team, the way they run their meetings. And I say, look, disagree but don't be disagreeable. Disagree in the meeting, but then make your cabinet decision, all thumbs up and agree. We've heard your arguments, but now go out and represent it as if your own. And I once made the mistake of slagging off my CEO when I was a managing director. And I said to my own team, he's decided to do this, but I didn't really agree with it. And my assistant said, did you challenge him? And I went, no, I didn't actually. So when you're slagging him off to us, when you're with him, do you slag us off to him? And I went, whoa. And I've never forgotten that lesson because it was just, I behaved so badly. I should have disagreed in the meeting, but then gone and represented as if it was my decision. And many businesses don't do that. They garner popularity by slagging off them up there or somebody else. They won't take that what you were brought up with, the accountability and the responsibility that mum made you wash the windows. And if they weren't done, she'd get you do them again. And why didn't you get it right first time, Bill? I thought that lesson stuck with me.
People always ask me about, again, I was very fortunate to have some great command sergeant majors, even as a Navy admiral, because of the jointness of the special operations. I generally had an Army E9, a command sergeant major that was working for me. When I was purely a SEAL, I had Master Chiefs E9, and I had 2 great ones. Command Sergeant Major Chris Ferris, who was with me in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then as my time as a SOCOM commander. And when I was as a Navy captain, I had a Master Chief named Steve Chamberlain, and both of them from entirely different backgrounds, but they had the same approach, which was if I was getting ready to make a difficult decision, I would call the Master Chief in or the Command Sergeant Major in, and we would have a conversation. And it could be a heated conversation, particularly after 9/11, because Chris Ferris had a lot of combat experience. And we would sit down, and most of the time we would be in agreement, but every once in a while it would get heated and fired up. But when he left my office, he owned that decision. And I tell people, look, when you're in a position to be a follower to a boss and you don't like what the boss has said, if you haven't had a chance, you're, again, to your point, you need to challenge it behind closed doors. But when you walk out, you have got to own that decision like it was your own. You can't go out and say, well, the boss is doing this, but roll your eyes. And because if you do that, you've just undermined the commanding officer. You've undermined everything.
Yeah.
And this is hard to do. And I have seen other senior enlisted and other officers not do it well. So when it is done well, particularly when you disagreed with the decision, and yet you have a responsibility as a senior enlisted or a junior officer to go out and own that decision and make sure the troops understand that you're supporting that decision. That's a hard thing to do. And the people that do it right make for a masterful organization.
Yeah. And I love the story when you were making out, in special forces, you wanted to do the real sexy jobs and, parachuting to Vladivostok. And instead you got called in for this really exciting operation and you thought it was good. And they told you that they wanted you to organize the frog float for the local town sort of gala. But your the hoary old commander sergeant major said, make it the best damn frog float there ever was. And every time you've had what appears to be pretty unexciting task, you've worked really hard to make it the best frog float it can be. And I will always remember that one. It stuck with me. Thinking about leaving a legacy, I love the comment you meant about you don't own the trident, that honorable trident badge you have. You're passing it on, you're looking after it for the next one. And legacies like that, the sort of stewardship of you don't own the command when you were in it. You're looking to make it better than you found it for the next person to take it on. With that in mind, you have left a legacy of three very famous things you were closely involved in or in command of: the rescuing of Captain Phillips, spending 30 days with Saddam Hussein when your guys had captured him, and then obviously the plan and executing the capturing and killing of Osama bin Laden. Do you want we haven't got a lot of time, but just give us a little, a learning from each of them. From the Captain Phillips one, what was the lesson you learned from running that operation to rescue him from Somali pirates?
Yeah, so the Captain Phillips. I mean, the great thing about today's environment, of course, is I was in Afghanistan at the time, and I'm having to video teleconference with the president and with the Secretary of Defense. I'm presenting a plan how we're going to parachute guys into off the coast of Somalia so we can be prepared to rescue this captain in a small lifeboat. But you have to, of course, rely and trust the guys that are on the ground or in the water in this case to do the right thing. So while my situational awareness, again, interestingly enough, you can imagine yourself in a command center, but the Navy ship that was nearby had a optical ball that I could direct in any direction, so I could see what was happening on the small vessel. We had a drone overhead, so I could see top down. I mean, I had pretty good situational awareness, and then I'm in a position where I can talk to the SEAL commander on the ship and all that sort of stuff. But still, you can't get to the point where you are a commander that's not on site and tell the guys, look, you're only going to take the shot when What I did was I general parameters. Look, I trust you because you are experienced people to take the shot or to rescue the captain when you think the conditions are right. You understand the basic conditions. I put you in a position to be successful. You got Navy ships, you got all the situational awareness you need. But at the end of the day, the guy on the ground has got to make the tactical decisions, and then you have to stand by it. And this was true, of course, day in and day out in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. As the senior officer in most of those times, I had either an Army colonel or a Navy captain working for me. They would bring the concept of operations to me. I would review the concept of operations, and that's an important word, not the tactical plan, the concept of operations. And then you have to rely on the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines that are on the ground or in the air to make the right decision based on the training. This is hard to do because you're like, well, look, at the end of the day, if this goes south, it's on me. Yes, it trickles down, but I can guarantee you the President of the United States was going to be looking at me for most of these things. But that's, again, what good leaders, I think, have a responsibility to do. They've got to trust their subordinates to make the right decisions as long as you've given them the training, the resources, and the latitude to do the job.
Yeah, and this is what is often missing in business. CEOs personally feel they have to get so micromanaging and doing everybody's job that they go, look, move out of the way, I'll do this. And then people feel disempowered and they don't do the right job because they don't feel they own it. And so it isn't something that they take naturally, what you were doing there. Yes, I know that you went on operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. People loved seeing you there with them, but you left them to get on with things. With Saddam, I mean, that was a fascinating one, even tracking him down to find him. But we were fascinated, you and I were talking about, there's, in business and in politics now, there's a lot of authoritarian, narcissistic, ego-filled leaders that we have. Saddam was like that. How did you handle someone like that when you had to look after him for about 30 days? He was under your responsibility, wasn't it?
Yeah, so the Army Special Operations Forces that were working for me captured him in December of 2003, and I held on to him for about 30 days. Um, and we treated him very well. We made sure he had 3 or 4 meals a day, and I always had a doctor or a corpsman or a medic in with him, make because he was an old man. He wasn't all that healthy. He had a lot of kind of old man problems. Um, but what was interesting to me was when we first captured him. He was pompous, he was arrogant. But when he no longer had his palaces and he no longer had his generals, he no longer had his handmaidens, he really just became a pathetic old man. And I always say, you contrast this with a Nelson Mandela who spent almost 30 years incarcerated. And because Mandela was a decent human being and strong, he kind of came out of that incarceration as strong, maybe stronger than when he went in. Because Saddam Hussein was kind of the classic bully, the classic narcissist, he kind of fell apart in about 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
When all of the trappings of power, which he relied on to be that person, when they disappeared, well, then his person disappeared with that. And I think that's the nature of narcissists or people that lead that are corrosive. Is they have a lot of things that surround them. Sometimes they're yes men and yes women. Sometimes they're the C-suite. Sometimes they're the corner office. Whatever it happens to be. You find out the truth about a person when all those things are gone. When they don't have the high paying job, they don't have people saying, yes, sir, no, sir, you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. Then you find out a lot about them, whether they're still good leaders. And I think this is why the military is, militaries around the world build great leaders, because you start off as a private or a corporal or a young ensign or a second lieutenant, and they don't pay you a whole lot. They don't give you a fancy car. They don't give you a whole lot of trappings. You're living in a tent. You're living whatever it happens to be, and you still have to lead. You have to be a person that knows how to lead men and women that are trying to follow you. And so, at some point in time, you get to be a 4-star, as I did, and yes, they give you a nice house and they get people to drive you around, but you can never forget that these are just trappings.
Yeah.
And that the good leaders and the ones you've seen before, the trappings they're important for a little bit of the visual aspect of being a 4-star, but they should not in any way, shape, or form make you think that you're better than anybody else below you.
It's a lovely story, and I think you had a fascinating time working with President Obama and George Bush. I think it was George or his father. When he'd finished being president, they asked him what he was going to do next. And he said, clean up the dog shit in the garden, I think. And then there was another one who, when he'd finished being president, they said, what did you do today? He said, I took the suitcases up into the attic, and it just like bringing that normality. And it's that humility which is so important. And that fits with another one of your sayings that you've used in the book, The Wisdom of the Bullfrog, about walking the line and being in touch with everybody and really the shared hardship of being a leader and not being so distant. I like that one. With Osama bin Laden, you were in touch with, you were running the operations in theater and in touch with the guys out there. I loved the way you had planned for almost like every eventuality. I was just a couple of hours ago interviewing Colonel Casey Campbell, who was an A-10 pilot, and she was saying this planning for eventualities when she got a missile strike, about 600 bullet holes or missile holes in her A-10, and she managed to get back. She got the Distinguished Flying Cross for that. But she had to have all these plans, and I thought it was so interesting with the Osama bin Laden operation. You and the guys were having all this. What if this happens? If we get detected on the border, if we get detected an hour in, 2 hours in? I thought that was really interesting. What was your big learning from the Osama bin Laden operation that you think is very relevant for business as well as for the military?
Yeah, by the time I was doing the bin Laden mission, so this was in 2011. I mean, I had been in the military 34 years at that point in time. And so I was very fortunate and probably done thousands of missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course, even before that, missions during my career. So the thing that I understood right up front was the importance of the planning aspect of this. And when I went to Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, I wrote my thesis on special operations, on the theory of special operations, and I had a chance to interview some remarkable leaders from almost all these missions, predominantly World War II, but a few afterwards, and I realized it was the planning and the rehearsals that made a difference. And interestingly enough, in every single case, every mission that I did a case study on, when the unit failed to rehearse a part of the mission, that part of the mission failed on the actual operation. And it reinforces
like the submarines that you told
like
to
the
get
submarines
the
and the Manila, right? The Manila line. So Admiral Godfrey Place, great naval officer who went up against the battleship Tirpitz during World War II up in Kafjord, Norway. They had like a year and a half to prepare for this, and they were going to have these big submarines, big diesel submarines, tow these little 3-man mini subs, and they would go out and they would rehearse the towing procedure. But because at the end of the line, the little submarine was doing this, the sailors inside were getting so sick, they said, look, when the time comes to do the mission, we'll just gut it up, we'll grit it out, we'll be fine. So they never rehearsed the full distance from Scotland across to Norway. And you know the story, Jonathan, but they had 2 lines, one Manila line and one nylon line. Nylon was kind of a new thing at the time. And the Manila lines, all 3 of them broke on the transit across, and they lost a bunch of sailors. And when I was interviewing Admiral Place, who, oh, by the way, received the Victoria Cross and then later on the St. George's Cross for his time in Korea, an incredible naval officer, he said to me, if only we had rehearsed the tow for the full length of the mission, we would have known that the Manila lines were going to break. But I went back and looked at every single mission, and that was true. So as we were planning the bin Laden raid, we did phase diagramming so that we looked at each event, and there were hundreds of events that we looked at from something as simple as the SEALs get on the trucks to go to the airfield. Okay, well, do we have enough trucks? Are the trucks fueled up? Do you have a truck driver? Does the truck driver know how to get to the place? Oh, by the way, this is a classified mission. Is the gate guard going to let them through the gate? I mean, you have to know all these things. Well, do we have backup trucks? So every one of these events was planned and looked at, worst case scenario, and then we had a backup plan for every event.
Yeah. And so few people do this in business. And indeed,
well, it's hard. I mean, it's time consuming and it's hard.
It's costly. And it's costly.
And it's costly, but it pays big dividends if you really put the work into it to do the planning and have the backup plans.
And that touches us on really lately in NATO and certainly the British Army, I know from my own experience. Many of my colleagues, as we shrink from 180,000, we were down to 70,000 now. As they keep getting smaller and smaller, they have just in time logistics rather than just in case. And so now we're giving a lot of our stuff to Ukraine, and we don't actually have the kit ourselves because we've thinned it out so much, and no one's going to do a short industrial run on a production line for a few bits of kit. While we're talking about that, I mean, just briefly looking at world politics, we got Iran, we got Russia, we got China threats. What's your reading of what's going on in the world? Because it's an area I know the sort of conflict and crisis is an area that fascinates you. What, in a simple way, what do you think's going on, or what's going to happen to NATO? I mean, it's a trouble.
I don't think there's a simple way to look at this. I think a lot of people are trying to come up with a theory of confluence where, well, Russia invades Ukraine. Does that then make Hamas prepared to attack Israel? Does that make the Chinese more? I don't know that they're all connected. I mean, Putin's rationale for invading Ukraine had nothing to do with, I think, what was going on in Gaza and now what's happening in Lebanon. Obviously, when you look at, and people ask me which one do I think is the most serious, I still will tell you that Ukraine, I mean, this is a major war on the European continent. While Gaza and what's going on in Lebanon is very concerning, and we need to worry about escalation. Make no mistake about it. When you take a look at the lives lost in Ukraine and the nature of this, two state actors going at each other, that's pretty serious. And you just don't know which way Putin will go. I'd say I've been very proud of NATO. I think NATO has stepped up. From an American standpoint, our European colleagues and our NATO colleagues have really done, yeoman's work to support the Ukrainians. I hope we continue to support them. I was out in Ukraine late November of last year. I had a chance to travel around a lot of places, down to Odessa, up to Kyiv, down to Lviv, talked to all the military commanders, had a chance to visit the special operations training place. And, you can't help but be inspired and impressed by the Ukrainians who are fighting for their homeland. Now, they're not a Jeffersonian democracy. Let's make no mistake about it. They've got a lot of problems, but God bless them. They're working through them, and they're trying to hold on. And I think we need to continue to support them. Obviously, what's happening, when I look at what's happening in Israel and Gaza and Lebanon, I mean, the attacks of October 7th were about as vile and barbaric as any we've seen in modern times. So the Israelis certainly had a strong reason to go after the Hamas leadership. You also, though, have to feel some compassion for the innocent Palestinians that have been kind of caught in the crossfire of what's happening in Gaza. As you know, Jonathan, we as military leaders, you have to go after the enemy, you have to prosecute the target, but you work really, really hard to, make sure that no civilians are killed in the process. And this has just been a tough, challenging fight for the Israelis. Urban warfare is never easy. And now, of course, the conflict has shifted to Lebanon, and that again, we're just hoping that doesn't continue to spiral out with Iran deciding to get involved. In the Pacific, I'm not overly worried that the Chinese are going to invade Taiwan anytime soon. We need to find a way to continue to work with the Chinese to kind of lower the temperature a little bit. But by the same token, we need to be strong in the Pacific. The allies, need to be strong in the Pacific. We need to work as Americans, we need to work with our Australian, our Japanese, our South Korean counterparts, and figure out a way to make sure that the Chinese know that it would not be worth it to try to invade Taiwan. Yeah. I don't really think that's their approach, but we need to make sure that's not their plan.
Well, fascinating, and we could talk much more, but we've only got a few minutes left. And I was just thinking about, with all that, many of the leaders, Xi Jinping, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, there's a lot of these strongmen, autocrats, and authoritarianism going on in the world. A lot of populism. I think they call the 3 Ps: post-truth, populism, and polarization. Where do you see it going? I mean, are we losing democracy? Is this going to be the way that people are going to go, or will we claw it back, do you think?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful and very confident that we'll get back to some level of appreciation for how strong democracies are. When you take a look at the arc of history, we go through this a lot. When I talk to my American colleagues here, they talk about how dysfunctional the country is right now. And I said, well, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s here in the United States, where John F. Kennedy was killed, Robert F. Kennedy was killed, Martin Luther King was killed. We had 4 students on Kent State campus were killed by Army National Guardsmen. We had civil rights protests and riots. We had war riots and protests going on. Things looked pretty dire then too. Now, this seems to have a little bit of a different feel to it now. But we will, in America, we will get through this no matter who is elected in 2024. We'll get past this. And I think we will, as we found in the 60s and 70s, you get into this kind of trough and then you come out of it. And it doesn't go like this. It's not a standard sine wave. To my way of thinking, it's an upward trajectory. Okay. Meaning that, yes, we go into these valleys and these dips, but when we come out of them, we're still moving upward. We're going to find that we will be better off. Whatever we learn from what's going on now, I think we will be better off. We will go back into another trough in a few years, but I think the progress of civilization over time continues to be an upward slope. Sometimes it's just barely upward, but I think it's always upward. And again, I've got great confidence in the people around the world. People want democracy. They want representative government. Nobody wants China and Russia to be leading the world effort. We need to make sure our allies, people that think like we do, that have the same values in terms of universal values, are leading the effort to make the world a better place.
No, it's great. And in reading your books and in talking with you, your love of history and the books and the research you did about sort of special forces operations all that time ago. You know historically what's sort of going on. You've been watching it, and you, of course, in your early part of your career, had many of the veterans who'd been in Vietnam. And I remember going to Fort Leavenworth when I was at the Army Staff College. I had a group of really superstar colleagues, and I was made the chief of staff of the brigade. I thought this is it. I'd arrived, but they all were, ended up as generals in special forces and the SAS and things like that. And they were all hugely ambitious, and it was really like herding cats. It was impossible. And I had this Vietnam general who was my mentor. He was a brilliant guy. And he goes in a long, slow drawl. I can't even do it in the proper American way, but he goes, Jonathan, you haven't got time to learn all the mistakes I made. He said, I'll tell you where the anti-personnel mines are buried, but overnight the little bastards have gone out and they've laid some more. I don't know where those ones are, but you don't need to stand on the same landmines that I stood on. So here, let me give you some advice and great mentoring. But I just thought I related strongly to you as you grew up with the Vietnam era
Yeah.
of experience. When I joined the Scots Guards as a platoon commander, they'd just come back from the Falklands War. So I hadn't been to war, but my platoon had, and others had. And the ones that they thought were going to be the heroes and talked a good story were actually cowards. And the ones who were the rogues who'd been drunk and disorderly and been a meth drinker in Glasgow took tumble down mountain, with machine guns and light anti-tank rockets. They were just great. So any thoughts about what you've learned both from history and from being with people in other conflicts as you were growing up?
Yeah, I think you see that's a great point, Jonathan, because when we bring young men into the basic SEAL training, um, we understand when they come in that we're looking for a certain type of guy. We are looking for the guy that's got the swagger, that is the alpha male, that probably is going to get in too many bar fights, that you're going to have to keep a short leash on, and you expect that the good order and discipline that you put into place will keep them between the bright red lines. But those are the guys you need when you got to go to war. Now, you still have to keep them between the bright red lines, or you will find them doing things that will not represent your unit well.
Yeah.
And this was particularly true in Iraq and Afghanistan. I always worried that, there were guys out there that, enjoyed the combat too much.
Yeah.
And I had a responsibility to make sure that, one, they did everything right and honorable, even if it was awful in having to kill people again and again and again, because when they came back, when the war was over and they were sitting someplace in the United States, I didn't want them to regret the fight they had been in. I wanted them to think that they fought hard, that they fought viciously, but that they fought honorably. And this is always the balance between the people we bring in, to the Scottish Guards, to the SEALs, to the SAS. Boy, they have got to have an edge to them. But the framework and the structure of leadership has got to keep them, like I said, between the bright red lines, so that they don't get off the reservation and do things that are dishonorable
Yeah.
for both men for the unit.
Yeah, and we're seeing that at the moment. Hey, look, just the last couple of minutes, and I know you're going to have to go. Would you kindly, just for the last 2 minutes, it's your top leadership tip. Would you kindly, as a piece in its own right, just introduce yourself, say a little bit about what you've done, and give us your top leadership tip, and that will finish us off beautifully.
Okay, you bet. I'm Bill McRaven. I'm a retired Navy admiral. I served 37 years as a Navy SEAL. When I retired in 2014, I became the Chancellor of the University of Texas System. It's a large higher system of higher education and healthcare here in the state of Texas with 220,000 students, 100,000 employees, and 14 different institutions. I really enjoyed that time. And now I am teaching, writing, speaking, and enjoying life. As far as my top leadership tip, it's probably not one thing, but when I was a young ensign, I had just graduated from SEAL training. I got to my first SEAL team, and I wanted to know, what did the enlisted guys think a good officer should look like? So we didn't call them mentors back there, but the lieutenant that had kind of taken me under his wing said, look, you need to go talk to the command master chief. And the command master chief was a Vietnam vet with a Navy Cross, the second highest award for valor in the U.S. And I sat down with the master chief and I said, Master, what do I need to do to earn the respect of the men that are serving with me. And again, at this time, almost everybody in the team were Vietnam vets, but me and a couple of other folks, because this was 1978. And he said, well, I think there's 4 things you have to do. First, you have to work hard. You've got to come in early. You got to work hard. You got to stay late. You have to come in on the weekends. You have to do whatever it takes to show the men that you're prepared to put in the hard work. You may not be the smartest, the fastest, the strongest SEAL, but if they see that you are working hard, they will respect you for it. Next, you need to be a good teammate. And a SEAL team, as you can well appreciate, it's like any sort of sport team. We had a locker room, we had playbooks, we have the dynamics of a team. He said, you have to be a good teammate. You've got to help people out when they fall down and stumble. You've got to be a good teammate in the locker room. You've got to work hard with the leadership. You've got to be a good teammate. Third thing he said was, you have to know your business. You have to learn the business of being a Navy SEAL. You need to know all your weapons. You need to know parachute. You need to know diving. You need to know land warfare. You need to know the business of being a Navy SEAL. And the final thing was the one that caught me by surprise, because let's just say the Master Chief was kind of a man of his time. And he said to me, look, you need to be a good person. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And he said, because if you're a bad person, if you're doing things that are going to bear on your conscience, if you're out womanizing, if you're out drinking too hard, if you're out doing drugs, if you're out doing things that you know are not right, then you will come in to work the next day and that will be weighing on your mind, and you will not be the best officer you can be. Be a good person, work hard, learn the business, be a good teammate, and you're going to do fine in the SEAL community. And those have followed me for all of my career and my life, I like to think.
Thank you very much indeed. It's truly inspiring, and it's a personal ambition to have you as my guest. Admiral Bill McRaven, thank you very much for being on the Inspiring Leadership Podcast.
Jonathan, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.